right, today we're going to talk about the ways in which the philosophical undercurrents of our political climate are changing our views of masculinity and gender norms. There is a crisis of masculinity in our postmodern, post-secular age. We have two camps, political camps, leftism and conservatism. And these camps have locked horns over masculinity, what it is, how it's supposed to work, what are its indispensable properties. Leftism tries to resist the marginalization of men who may not fit into the cultural or traditional masculine norm, right? They decry that hegemony as machismo, and applauding male feminists, and are always calling out and decrying toxic masculinity. Conservatism, on the other hand, right, pushes conformity with traditional gender norms, and they call men who can't fit into these traditional practices of masculinity effeminate and effeme. But at the heart of this conflict isn't really a political disagreement so much as it is a philosophical difference of perspective, really a worldview perspective, in which leftism draws on a fundamentally postmodern view of the world, and conservatism draws upon realism. Now, postmodernism emphasizes the subjectivity of truth, and this is not a bad emphasis to highlight. In this perspective, the notion of objective truth is a way for majority culture to enforce its ideological hegemony upon the marginalized, and to make those who don't fit in feel like they should fit in, thereby extending the circumference of their influence, adding data points to their evidence bank that their view of the world is correct. In plotting the autobiographical and self-interested skew of all of this data, postmodernists, they often, in highlighting accurately the subjectivity of truth, they defer the certainty of truth with a suspicion of a personal agenda behind all truth claims. Realism, on the other hand, seeks to maximize the amount of assumptions that speakers can reasonably take for granted. So, unlike the postmodern, who situated firmly in what philosophers call a hermeneutic of suspicion, in which they're always sniffing out meta-narratives, ways that individuals are trying to make everybody else think that their way of viewing the world is the only right way of viewing the world, right? So that's the postmodern perspective, which conflates the credibility of a truth claim with the moral scrutability of the speaker. But on the other hand, the realist seeks to take as much for granted as possible for the sake of progressing a rational conversation. Now, that doesn't mean that postmoderns are unreasonable and realists are reasonable. There are strengths and weaknesses to both philosophical perspectives. So for the postmodern, speech at its best is always a creative, constructive act which rectifies or creates power imbalances. Whereas for the realist, speech is always a referential act. So consequently, for postmodernists, right speech is equalizing speech. Whereas for realists, right speech is accurate speech. The weakness of postmodernism is that it's not really a workable philosophy in that it can't take account for the fact that language on the whole does seem to reliably work for us, communicatively. Okay, it fails to sort of account for the phenomena of linguistic success. That is, for the fact that communication regularly realizes the interests of speakers in the minds of their listeners. And the notion that truly objective speech is always obscured by the speaker's agenda is betrayed by the commonality of communicative success among speakers. So the weakness of realism, though, is that it really fails to take seriously the value of autobiographical data for understanding a truth claim. Really, realism can just tend to be a little bit philosophically naive. And in its being numb to these autobiographical skewings of data, can kind of fail to see the way in which truth can be construed to serve the interests of the speaker. And they can sort of fail to see that the role of personal narrative and the history of ideas in shaping the concepts that we employ in order to make these truth claims. Now, this comes into play especially with ideas that can become very complex and abstract, like masculinity. And at the heart of the disagreement between postmodernism and realism, and consequently between leftism and conservatism, is the question, is there such a thing as masculinity? If so, what is it? And how do we know? And the middle ground between postmodernism and realism is a position that takes the strengths of both approaches and discards the weaknesses. This position would configure the certainty with which an object of knowledge could be known in a way that values both the postmodern sensitivity to autobiography and the realist insistence upon accuracy. Philosophers typically have called this approach critical realism. In theology, N.T. Wright has sort of capitalized on this epistemological perspective. The postmodern sensitivity to autobiography manifests itself as a criterion for truth, which is authenticity to oneself. This is why postmodernists have capitalized upon this concept of my truth, or tell your truth. The realist insistence upon accuracy manifests itself as a different criterion for truth, not as authenticity to oneself, but as conformity to a norm. This is why realists have capitalized upon, for example, Ben Shapiro's slogan, facts don't care about your feelings, which is in a sense, and in a realist sense, true. Authenticity, postmodern authenticity, and realist conformity would, in a critical realist configuration of the truth, be cast not as competitive concepts where you have to choose between being authentic to your perception and assimilating to a norm. You wouldn't have to choose between those two things. They wouldn't be cast as competitive concepts, but rather be cast as cooperative concepts. And as cooperative concepts, authenticity is conceived not as unfiltered expressivism, but as creative empiricism, an active shaping of one's experience that is accountable to objective reality. Likewise, conformity is not conceived as a bald erasure of individuality, but rather a conformity of oneself to a worthwhile and reasonable ideal, which makes one's autobiographical perspective not solipsistic, but serving the validity of one's take on the world. A critical realist definition of masculinity would therefore need to be more than a singular definition. It would need to be a complex of concepts that accounts for the unity and diversity of male experience. So the best definition of masculinity will maintain, on the one hand, the ideality of the concept, which the realist and the conservative champions, and the individuality of each man, really, which the postmodern champions in its conception of masculinity. In order to do this, we must first supply a single definition of masculinity, and thereafter kind of unpack the complexity which makes this definition suitable to reality for the realist and workable for all men, that is, for the postmodern. Okay? So our initial definition of masculinity that we'll just throw out there and see how suitable and how workable it can be is this. Masculinity is a man's maximization of his potential for competence. Now, there are three simple elements to this definition: maximization, potential, and competence. Competence is the foundational content here, okay? Competence refers to basically one's ability to overcome obstacles in the pursuit of a particular goal compared to other men pursuing that goal. So an undergraduate student may be very competent in Calculus 101 at his local junior college, and utterly incompetent in a calculus course at MIT. In both scenarios, his ability to overcome obstacles is an intersection of his proximate peer context and his mathematical ability, both his cultivated ability and his innate ability. These obstacles before him are not merely mathematical, but competitive with his peers and performative with regard to his professor and transformative with regard to himself, to the degree that he turns innate capacity or innate competence into cultivated competence. And his competence is measured by his fixed capacity to produce calculations, combined with the production expected of him by his competitors and his evaluators and himself. So that's what competence is. It is one's ability to overcome obstacles in the pursuit of a particular goal compared to other men pursuing that goal. Okay? Potential, from the Latin potentia, refers to the ceiling of competence that each individual has. So this potential is both fixed and flexible. So a paralytic man will never run a 4-minute mile, but he may find a way to strengthen his muscles over which he has mechanical control, right? And to cultivate other competencies which allow him to exhibit mastery in the universe and therefore masculinity. The better, for example, that I get at basketball, the higher the ceiling of my competence grows. But even if that ceiling has a set growth cap, that cap is beneath LeBron James, for example. So it is here that the variegation of men from individual to individual finds its metaphysical home in our definition of masculinity. It is in potential that postmodernism and realism make meaningful contact, because not every man has the same potential for competence. Fixed and flexible ceilings for potential are the conceptual space in which male diversity must be accounted for. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second when we talk about maximization. So let's just state our definition of masculinity one more time, okay? Masculinity is a man's maximization of his potential for competence. We talked about what competence is. We talked about what potential is. Now we're talking about what maximization is, okay? Now, maximization refers to the intentional elevation of one's flexible ceiling for potential through the pursuit of competence. Here, the rubber meets the road of masculinity. Competency is to some degree an abstract concept, and every man has some sort of potential, but maximization is always about choice. So maximization, it is the proper domain of responsibility. It is the hinge upon which the futures before every man, the two futures, great man and wasted potential, they both turn on this hinge of whether or not you will maximize your potential for competence. The obvious weakness of this definition for masculinity, then, is that it could be copied and pasted onto a definition for femininity. Okay, and this is true. Okay, this is also why masculinity cannot merely have a singular definition, but requires a singular complex to account for the phenomenon that we call masculinity. And that's what we're going to delve into more here. Okay, so now that we've set up a definition of masculinity as a man's maximization of his potential for competence, we must now explain how this definition really works itself out in a complex and diverse landscape that accounts for every man everywhere. Because that's the burden of a definition of masculinity, is that it has to, on the one hand, account for every man everywhere, and on the second hand, semantically differentiates itself from the concept of femininity, because we live in a binary gendered species. And to do this is very difficult because, on the one hand, if you give a definition of masculinity that is too uniform, then it won't count for every man. But if you give a definition of masculinity that's too flexible, then it won't be able to sufficiently differentiate itself from femininity. So that's the burden of this definition. So our definition, again, is masculinity is a man's maximization of his potential for competence. Okay, so in order to give this definition, in order to make this definition suitable to men and workable for men, we have to elucidate on three aspects of masculinity, which make our singular definition possible. And these aspects are, so to speak, what's under the hood of masculinity in every sense, in a way that constrains and takes into account the postmodern leftist and the realist conservative, okay? And that's why masculinity has to be broken down into three concepts. It's not a single concept, okay? It's like when you look at an engine. It's like, what's an engine? It's a lot of things doing a lot of different projects. It performs a single purpose, but it's a conglomeration of operations that work toward a single end. And masculinity saying that this is what masculinity is, it's like saying this is what an engine does, okay? Or this is what an engine is. It's something that gets your car from A to B. But in order to understand really what it is, you have to understand the various components which simultaneously and differentially operate within the concept. And the three parts of masculinity, which operate differently and serve separate purposes and are all equally essential to this concept, are this: maleness, manliness, and manhood. Now, you're probably getting like a little bit disoriented here because now we have four concepts at play: masculinity, which is the big picture, and then the three constituent parts of masculinity, which are maleness, manliness, and manhood. Okay? And we're going to break that down here in terms of what those concepts are and how they interrelate to one another and how they operate to produce masculinity. Now, first, maleness is biological masculinity. Now, this is most basically a man's XY chromosome, okay? In the biological aspect, a man's maximization for his potential for competence manifests itself as the pursuit of the highest attainable strength, speed, shelter, sexual and hunting prowess, and other body-oriented skills that are base and elemental, okay? These are the least sophisticated and most straightforward competencies. Now, this isn't to say that, a man can't pursue them in a profoundly sophisticated manner, but we're going to get to that in a second. But rather, we're saying that all other competencies of masculinity rely upon and presuppose the basic maximization of the ability to overcome the highest number of physical obstacles and to become as physically competent as possible. That's what masculinity is in terms of maleness. And maleness is fixed. There is nothing refutable about the distinctiveness or factuality of male biology from female biology, okay? In this regard, maleness is the irreducible and crude evidence that human species is divided along a single line. And not only are men men, but they are likewise not women. Now, the distinction between maleness and femaleness and its foundational role for masculinity is what enables masculinity and femininity to have the same formal definition while differentiating materially. Which means this: masculinity is a man's maximization of his potential for competence, right? And femininity is a woman's maximization of her potential for competence. So a man's competencies are composed basically of a male genotype from which the manly phenotype emerges. And a woman's competencies are composed basically of a female genotype from which a female phenotype emerges. Masculinity and femininity can be in definition materially opposite, while nevertheless formally identical. So in other words, the formula are the same: the maximization of one's potential for competence, but the variables are all different. Male in one, female in the other, starting from different places and operating along parallel but distinct trajectories. So that's what maleness is. Maleness is biological maleness and its respective domain of competencies, such as physical strength and prowess and such. Okay? Manliness, distinct from maleness, manliness is cultural masculinity. This is, if maleness is the male genotype, manliness is the male phenotype. Okay? And a phenotype is a transmitted tradition of ways in which men maximize their male competencies to pursue complex games of mixing those male competencies. So manliness is cultural masculinity. Manliness is a man's ability to ascend a social hierarchy and to overcome more abstract obstacles related to social well-being and belonging. And these competencies are fundamentally creative, such as like critical thinking, problem solving, meta-analysis, right? So if maleness is the masculine genotype and manliness is the masculine phenotype, then manliness is the aspect of masculinity which traverses the biological with the socially constructed. Okay, manliness is the sophisticated abstraction of maleness that verifies the legitimacy of male competencies and quantify the utility of male competencies such as strength and sexual prowess. Okay, manliness is the set of games that men have come up with over generations that they employ to test and to cultivate and to operationalize the brute competencies of maleness for the sake of the survival of the tribe and for the survival of each individual. So, therefore, while strength, which is a male competency, lies properly within that domain of maleness, culturally defined manliness may measure to what degree that strength can be consistently integrated with other competencies in the form of labor, hard work, combat, provision, protection, establishing a social order. So maleness supplies the ingredient competencies and manliness the constructed and prepared recipe of masculinity, okay? So here, leftists ought to see the analogy, okay? This is where male diversity comes into the picture. So yes, manliness is a social construct. Manliness absolutely is a social construct. That doesn't mean it's not real, okay? A meatball is a social construct, okay? But the culinary laws have been attuned through tradition over generations, over time, to the fixed palates of human biology, okay? And like fashion, manliness is relative, it's subjective, it's socially constructed in a sense. Its customs vary from culture to culture, but there are universal anthropological realities which have been passed down across all generations, and these concepts remained fixed and accountable to immutable physical realities, which is still to say nothing of their metaphysical counterparts, whether masculinity is something which actually does exist out there. And many leftists who want to dispense with certain manliness tropes and manliness cultural norms, just because they don't see themselves in those norms, really don't often appreciate the role socially that for which these norms have been tested through war and famine and disease to survive and to protect the tribe and to protect women and children and to protect themselves. Okay? Manliness norms have been tested and created for us, generation after generation, nuanced and honed for the sake of our survival and our happiness and our well-being. And we can't just dispense with them just because we don't see straightforwardly how we fit into them. And it is in this domain of manliness that the conservative criterion for truth, which is conformity, assimilation into the norm, that's where this is established. That's where this happens, okay? And as a side note, we can distinguish here between two kinds of manliness, okay? Fraternal manliness and paternal manliness. And these are two ways of looking at the same competencies. Fraternal manliness basically measures the competencies relative to other men, whereas paternal manliness measures the utility of a man's competencies in the domain of his responsibility for his family and for his community. If we take the competency, for example, of hand-to-hand combat, with regard to other men, a man's ability to fight with his hands is a base incentivization for other men not to disrespect him too severely. That's fraternal manliness. While this same skill is a direct means of securing physical security and safety for his family. That's paternal manliness with regard to his social function with his own family. So now we have the male aspect of masculinity and its operation, the manliness aspect of masculinity and its operation. Now we're moving on from the biological, which is the male, to the cultural, which is the manly, to the psychological, which is manhood. Okay, so you've got maleness, manliness, and manhood, the three constituent aspects of masculinity. Manhood is individual masculinity. This is a man's making manliness his own. It is in his manhood that a man makes games for himself, which maximize the competencies of maleness and manliness. Now, these higher competencies are more soft relational skills such as sympathy, empathy, philosophy, value, humility, self-confidence, therapeutic skills like emotional fluency, goal setting, emotional self-regulation, recovery from failure, religious philosophy, right? It is in this domain of manhood that a man may also filter out aspects of manliness ideas like skillfulness in fighting and aggression and protection and competitiveness. He may filter out some of these ideals or hone them or sophisticate them so that they are not counterproductive to his manhood ideals. It is in this domain that a man may also, filter out aspects of manliness ideals which are counterproductive to his manhood. For example, a man may have made himself very strong through physical training, which is a male competency. And he also may have made himself very good at winning physical confrontations, which is a manliness competency. But this may be diagnostic, or it may inflame a baseline aggression that compromises his ability to be at peace with himself and with his family and with his neighbors. So a man may seek to increase the sophistication of his strength and physical confidence by seeking emotional security so that he knows when strategically to use his male competencies and his manliness competencies without subverting and undermining his manhood competencies or his manhood objectives. And by doing this, he learns that in the same way that maleness competencies do not scale to manliness competencies, right? So if you're strong, which means that you've mastered a male competency, but you're dumb, you're not going to be good at fighting, right? Not really in like a mixed martial arts context, right? Because it requires a lot of problem solving. It's high stakes problem solving, right? Or if you're weak, but you're really smart, you will lack a degree of respect and you'll lack a degree of confidence. So you can't double down on one competency and hope that it'll translate to all the other spheres. It won't, right? Like if you pursue only manhood, but don't pursue any male competencies like physical strength or any manly competencies like skillfulness at work or skillfulness at fighting, all of your emotional security won't really have any evidence behind it. It'll just be wishful thinking, right? So manliness competencies don't necessarily scale to manhood competencies, right? Protecting and providing for one's family and winning competitive matches with peers, or even learning how to really take control of your emotions, none of these things directly translate into all the other domains, which is why all three have to be operating simultaneously. You have to be pursuing virtues which make you a good husband, and competencies which make you a good father, and competencies which make you a good friend and protector, and a good person. So it is also in the domain of manhood that the postmodern criterion for truthfulness, authenticity, is established because it is distinctly individual. It is the domain in which man makes for himself the genotypical and phenotypical fixedness of his masculinity particular to himself and relative to himself and suited to his particular family and goals and needs and strengths and weaknesses. Here, postmodern authenticity comes to play as a really valuable operational concept, again, in cooperation with these realist objective concepts, which have their role in the male and manly aspects of masculinity, okay? So here is where leftists and conservatives usually both take a wrong turn, okay? Leftists decry the violence that restrictive conceptions of manhood do to marginalized male types, right? The male feminists, due to the fact that manhood is always rooted in a culturally constructed conception of manliness. Conservatives cling to manliness, but fail to see that it is a highly individual, culturally relative concept which, while rooted in biology, is not straightforwardly unilateral in a simple sense. Right? So on the one hand, you've got leftists who are saying, hey man, men should be effeminate and they should be emotionally sensitive. And really, what is masculinity? It's not about being strong. Wrong. It is about being strong. And it is about being good at things. And it is about working hard. And it is about becoming good at fighting. And it is about becoming good at hunting. It's about developing as many competencies as you possibly can to become the best man that you possibly can across these three domains of maleness, manliness, and manhood. It's about all of those things, okay? And on the other hand, you have the alternate meme of the man who goes and deadlifts for 2 hours a day and can deadlift 600 pounds and bench press 400 pounds, right? And he makes fun of the guys who are pursuing intellectual competence because he can't possibly understand why you wouldn't reduce masculinity to these base male competencies. You have men who can't see past the maleness of their masculinity, right? Which is kind of the bro culture dude meme that you get. And unfortunately, the leftist meme of masculinity can become so effeminized that there really is no such thing as men at all. And on the other hand, you have the conservative meme of masculinity, which is so stupid and refuses to sophisticate its conception of masculinity at all, to the point where it's actually really easy to shrug off and sort of not take seriously, because it doesn't actually value the higher order competencies which individualize the phenotypical traditions that we have inherited from previous generations to our new modern lifestyle. So on the one hand, we want to honor the need for competencies, and particularly distinctive male competencies, and on the other hand, recognize the individuality of each man and the particularity of his situation. Okay? And to write off either of those things is ultimately to do a disservice to what masculinity is and how it ought to operate for each man. So, leftists take all the cultural constructs to be arbitrary, and conservatives justify the value of cultural constructs by reducing manhood just to bare manliness, or at its worst, bare maleness, by exhausting individual masculinity with cultural masculinity. And you shouldn't do this. Instead, we need to continue to come back to our conception of masculinity that we've laid out here, and to continue to pursue this definition, which I'll state one more time, okay? In summary, masculinity is a man's maximization of his potential for competence in the domain of his maleness, his genotype, his manliness, his phenotype, and his manhood, his psychology. This definition, it satisfies the postmodern concern for the relevance of each man's autobiographical data to the abstract definition of masculinity, and it also satisfies the realist concern for the objectivity of masculinity as an ideal toward which men ought to strive and often fail to achieve. This critical realist configuration of masculinity, it enables men to call themselves to a higher physical standard, higher cultural standard, higher psychological standards, while retaining, on the other hand, the right and the duty to reject misappropriations of maleness or manliness to the final goal of masculinity, to optimally configure one's manhood for oneself in a way that is both true to oneself in a postmodern sense and true to the world in a realist sense.